In this video, I'm going to be creating a scale replica of the Dark Portal from World of Warcraft's Burning Crusade. For those of you that haven't played the game, the portal is the starting point of the expansion, as it opens up and allows us brave adventurers access to Outland, a foreign alien planet filled with ogres, orcs, and other fantastic creatures. Stepping through the portal for the first time was awe-inspiring. The sheer scale of it makes you feel small and insignificant. As the game relaunched recently, I was inspired to take a shot at building a replica of this iconic landmark at a scale fit for tabletop gaming. I knew that a build of this magnitude would require quite a bit of planning to pull off. So my first step was figuring out the real-world dimensions of this monstrosity and converting it to 1/64 scale afterwards. I started by taking some quasi-scientific reference measurements using my in-game avatar. It looks like the height of this thing is somewhere around 250 feet. Which would put it roughly at 4 feet in height at 1/64 scale. That's a bit bigger than I wanted to make this thing, so let's scale it down just slightly in favor of the thing fitting on the game table and not touching the ceiling. So as a starting point, I used a model exported directly from the game. I was able to import it into Fusion 360 and get some accurate measurements for all the various components. This also lets me categorize them as well, as I would need to either scratch build, 3D print, or sculpt each bit from clay. For all the square blocky features such as the base, the pillars, and the top stone, XPS foam and cardboard would be my go-to materials. Since this is a rather large build, I'm going to leave the various bits unglued and freestanding, so they can be moved and stored easily. I would not be able to move this thing through a doorway otherwise. One large part will be this base, which actually sort of looks like an Aztec or a Mayan structure. That's great since it can serve as a different terrain structure than just the portal. I'm all for multiple uses. Starting off with some thin MDF and cutting it to size as needed, and then using XPS foam for the perimeter. I blocked out the rough shape of the base. I used a hot wire table for most of the cuts, but a sharp Olfa blade will do the trick for most of it. And I did in fact use the knife for a lot of cuts where I wanted a bit more of a texture or a ripped cut. My glue of choice here is construction adhesive for its strong bond. Once cured, this turns into a rock hard glue, and it's used in the construction industry for gluing all sorts of things together, such as concrete or wood. So gluing foam together should be no problem. To save on some XPS foam, I opted to cut out cardboard for most of the flat areas on top. This will get covered up with EVA foam and textured. Now, in order to get the pattern I saw in my reference model, I designed this floor stamp and 3D printed it out. By heating up the EVA foam and pressing the stamp in, I can get these floor tile lines across the floor. They're not going to all show up once painted, but that works for me in this case, where a hint of texture here and there will sell the whole effect. For the diagonal braces, I roughly cut each to size and carved out the channels with an Olfa blade. These were then slotted in with some PVA glue and kind of pressure fit in. The stairs were exported and 3D printed on an angle and also glued in place. They really set the scale for the whole build. Alright, moving on to the pillars. These have a specific sloping profile, which I was able to rough out in cardboard first, and then, using that, I cut it out of XPS foam once I had the guide. Together with some corner pieces, it looks like a set of 3 massive stacked stones now. The pillars have this super interesting design on the sides as well, which I wanted to replicate. So using the texture found in the game files, I exported it and turned them into 3D stamps using free lithopaint software. Same trick as the floor, heating up the EVA and then pressing it in to get the pattern. Some of the imprints are a bit fainter than I would have liked, so I think the level of heat and the pressure I apply play a huge factor in how good of an imprint I get. Still, with a bit of a dark wash and dry brushing, I'm sure I can pick these details out. For the top stone, I opted to go straight to cardboard. Once cutting out the rough dimensions, some hot glue and tape let me assemble it together. And then I came in with some smaller XPS foam cut to size, and I was able to add all the details on the front, such as these arches. Other bits that were sculpted from XPS were these towers at the front of the platform. These are nothing more than just some cubes and a little round hole cut for an LED tea light. One of the lights actually ran out of batteries as I was building this, so I'll need to replace it, but that's why I left the top removable. There was a second set of these, but smaller, flanking the inner stairway, but I chose not to recreate those as I don't really like the way they look. Now, the statues were an interesting challenge, as the sword that came with the 3D rendered model was way too skinny to print out right. I ended up modeling my own to fit the rough dimensions and made it extra chunky so that it wouldn't snap in half. I don't typically like printing large models like this, since the layer lines will be quite visible all the way up. But in this case I made an exception, since final statues would get a lot of plaster added, just to tie in all the textures, so it was acceptable. I also printed this spiked cube thing. Not exactly sure what its practical purpose is, but it dangles to the left side of the portal here on a massive chain. I would imagine it's probably placed there to just encourage you to click that like button, or as a sort of landmine for dragon attacks. Either one, really. All I did to this feature was slice it up so that it would print without supports. The chain got cut in half, and the spikes each printed separately and reassembled with super glue. Now the dragon head was probably the most massive print. I was a bit intimidated by the prospect of sculpting it out, so having access to this tech really saved me here. Again, I ended up slicing it so that it would print without supports. One at the neck here, and then along the middle to get each set of spikes of the head printing correctly. I decided that 2 dragon arms would be clay sculpted. They are even bigger than the head, and they don't actually have that much detail in the 3D model. Game developers like to save polygons and add a lot of the detail through textures instead. The initial shape of the arms was done in cardboard, and then bulked out with some aluminum foil and XPS foam. This was my first real foray into sculpting large things from clay, and I learned a lot from it. Still, these vaguely claw-looking bits of clay would look fine once covered in plaster and dry brushed to look like stone. They are meant to be sculptures after all, so... Oh, speaking of plaster, it's going to be the unifying factor for all the bits we've made here, so let's apply it liberally. It acts as a great gap filler as well, and creates an interesting texture over the large cardboard top stone. I didn't want any of the corrugated patterns showing through. Once dry, I gave everything a nice coat of black gesso. This is the stuff artists use to prime canvas before painting, and it's quite cheap for the quantity that you get. It has some additives that make it a good primer for a lot of porous surfaces, such as cardboard, XPS, and plaster. The only thing that it's not a great primer for is these metal plates. I added these in an attempt at magnetizing the pillars onto the base, but in retrospect, these aren't really necessary. The weight of the whole structure is more than capable of keeping the pillars in place. Right, back to painting. The black base coat actually took a long time to apply, and I really had to wait for it to dry fully before proceeding. Looking at the reference model, I pulled the main colors that we see here. It's actually a bit deceptive. The midtones and highlights are just browns and tans. But the purple and the shadows is what gives it this otherworldly feel. To replicate this scheme, I did just that. Airbrushed some tans and browns to get the main definition of the highlights and the midtones. And then I came in with a heavy purple dark wash for all the recesses. And finally coming with a final light dry brush to get some more tan and light brown. Very simple paint scheme that really makes everything pop. Now, one of my patrons actually suggested something awesome. If I had a tablet, I could place it in the portal opening to make a cool dynamic effect. Unfortunately, the only tablet I found around the house is much too small to serve the purpose, so I'll have to settle for a powered down version of the portal before it's activated to let the heroes of Azeroth begin their journeys into Outland. I've shared most of the progress of this build with my patrons. If that's something that interests you and you want to keep up to date with what I'm working on, your support would be very much appreciated. Now until next time, I'll see you around.